Just give up. That's the message that anyone involved in the Sony backlash has met with, whether it's coming from games media, advocates of an all-digital storefront, or even games analysts or ex-Sony executives. It's been a consistent wave of you're not going to get them to change because reasons. Almost like they feel Sony is too big to fail. But we've seen this exact brand of gaming hubris cause some gaming heavyweights to come crashing back down to terra firma before. 2018's BlizzCon disaster when announcing Diablo Immortal and those devs getting booed and famously poking the angry crowd by asking them, "Don't you guys have phones?" How about EA's online gambling simulator, aka Star Wars Battlefront 2, which was hit with a massive online petition and pushback, sound familiar? Forcing EA to clean up the loot box pay-to-win BS, and then they abandoned that game shortly thereafter. And who can forget whatever in the hell Call of Duty Black Ops 7 was going for with this one. Point being, all of these did tremendous harm to the respective studios and IPs, and whereas maybe if the executives in charge had the consumer's best interests at heart, they possibly could have been avoided. But more often than not, companies like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, and now Sony view the worldwide gamer base as their own personal cash register. And honestly, I'm beginning to think they believe we're just a bunch of effing idiots. Xbox thought that a gaming subscription service where you get to rent games but never own them was pure gold. And that backfired, causing them to lose 4 million subscribers once they increased the prices by 50% up to $30, which ended up being a disaster. And that's just one recent example. Sticking to the more current, we've seen games media point towards the Black Ops port digital sales as a way of saying that Sony's physical media backlash movement was all but over a week after it started. PlayStation no disc, no buy boycott immediately splinters in the face of Black Ops ports. Sony finally posted something without getting ratioed. But the physical media pushback is still very much alive, despite comments like this one saying, "Hate to say this, but Sony might have been correct to call their current physical outage a load of bluff when most people are getting easily folded by the Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and 2 PS4 and 5 ports shadow drop, literally crashing the whole PlayStation store." Or another one here laughing at the resolve of those involved in the Sony pushback, saying, "Some of the people who claimed no disc, no buy have already folded. It ain't been a week, bro. LMAO." But here's the thing with these ballers and shooters, you don't have their support to begin with. FIFA, basically anything EA Sports, and games like Call of Duty, those players are stuck to those franchises and they're going to follow them to no end. And all you need to do is look at the sales numbers of the Black Ops ports, which overtook GTA 6 on the PlayStation Store. As one commenter said, buying two 16-year-old games with no updates for $40, each with a separate purchase of DLC for $30, y'all are farmed cattle GG. So yeah, I wouldn't take a single post about a shadow-dropped Call of Duty port as the end-all be-all that the physical media initiative is now dead. PlayStation's Twitter feed is still a hotbed of activity with posts like the aforementioned Call of Duty now getting hit with a community note, all the way over to this other one for Ark Knight Infield with 1,100 likes to over 2,500 comments, including this response calling out the cash grab attitude and tone-deaf action Sony has now taken. And this is an interesting one here. It says, "How to lose your fans in one post." So yeah, this backlash is still as potent as when it was first announced, despite the games media articles and tweets citing Call of Duty sales. So much so that in the last 2 weeks, we've seen untold amounts of progress now made with emulation for PlayStation 5 games, because if fans aren't able to own their own DRM-free games or able to buy them in the form they choose, they're going to find a way to take them the way that they want them. And this has to scare Sony to no end, because it flies in the face of the very thing they are pushing for: total control. It's also interesting timing, and a little side note here, as Sony seems to be trotting out anyone that they can find to reinforce their position, including ex-executives who are now lying about Sony's digital pricing models, while shifting blame away from Sony while pointing it directly at third-party publishers, which we'll get into next. I can't confirm this, but it feels like a low-key sign of panic is setting in with Sony, because When you happen to trot out the former boss of the PlayStation Store to run interference for your universally hated digital-only announcement, that tends to look like a sign of desperation, especially when that former boss can't even get his facts straight. As Games Radar said in their headline, former PlayStation Store boss says retail price is set directly by the publisher as digital draws ire for being more costly than the physical discs Sony is killing. Listen to this one. PlayStation Store's former boss has spoken out about allegations of monopolization and price manipulation on Sony's storefront, claiming that it's actually publishers that set the recommended retail price for games, which is awfully rich considering what comes later in this article, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Gordon Thornton was with Sony Interactive Entertainment for 18 years, including his time as Senior Vice President and Global Head of the PlayStation Store and Services. So, one would logically assume if there was someone who knew the inner workings about what was going on with the PS Store, it would be this guy. Here's where this thing just goes completely off the rails, though. Gordon goes on to say, quote, regarding allegations of monopolization and price manipulation, PlayStation operates on a buy-sell model where the publisher acts as the supplier. Remember that point he just made. Because the recommended retail price is set directly by the publisher. Sony does not control these pricing structures, which counters claims of unilateral price fixing. Now, for those of you who are around and remember the drama the day before, the fantastical MMO zombie shooter that proved way too good to be true, one of the things that game went through is a copyright claim against the name itself because the guys running the show over at Fantastic Studios were severely incompetent and they failed to file for the rights to the name the day before they decided to name the game that. And overall, this was a good old-fashioned gaming drama that I would probably score a 9.5 out of 10. Anyways, I digress. One thing I love doing is diving into the X's and O's of court filings, which I did with that game. And here with Gordon Thornton's claims, Games Radar also gives us the key to the safe. A massive contradiction coming to us from all places, a class action complaint filed back in 2021. Found very easily on page 4, section 7, it says, on April 1st, 2019, Sony eliminated retailers' ability to sell download codes for digital PlayStation games because delivering digital content to PlayStation consoles requires access to Sony's PlayStation Network. The new policy established the PlayStation Store as the only source from which consumers can purchase digital PlayStation games, and the only source to which video game publishers can sell digital PlayStation games. Sony also requires publishers who sell digital games on the PlayStation Store to relinquish full control over the retail price. As a result, the policy swiftly and effectively foreclosed any and all price competition in the retail market for digital PlayStation games. In fact, in a motion to dismiss filed in 2022 while Thornton was still with SIE, Sony actually acknowledged the claim that it forced publishers to cede control over the final retail price of digital games to Sony, while going on to explain it away by mentioning that under this wholesale model, Sony and the publisher-developer agree upon a wholesale price, and then Sony sets the retail price that it will charge consumers on the PlayStation Store. So, which is it, my man, Mr. Thornton, former head of the PlayStation Store? Because according to Sony's own court admissions, it's not the publisher who is raising the prices, it's you. So when we look at the price disparity of what Brazilian gamers actually are paying for physical games outside of the physical store versus what they can find inside the PlayStation ecosystem, are you saying that we need to give Sony a free pass here and instead need to blame Beethoven and Dinosaur or publisher Annapurna Interactive for that 47.79% markup they can find in the PlayStation Store when attempting to buy Mixtape? Are you also saying we need to point the finger at Team Cherry for that 48.13% price increase for their smash hit Hollow Knight Silksong when attempting to purchase it through Sony? No, but that's what we're seeing from those attempting to defend this announcement to move over to all digital. Lies, deflection, and early surrender to what they see as Sony's overwhelming force. We spoke about CEO of Japanese games industry consulting firm Kantan Games, Dr. Serkan Toto, in our last video, who is the owner of a quote that's been making all the rounds through games media, pointed at what the PlayStation Plus subscription cancellations would end up doing to Sony, saying, quote, Sony has over 120 million active PlayStation users. Around 50 million people subscribe to PlayStation Plus. As a thought experiment, let's say 500,000 cancel and protest, that would be just 1% of that business gone. Of course, not enough for Sony to start rethinking. Digital is just too lucrative. And I know, it sounds ominous, like opponents of Sony's digital media initiative don't stand a chance, but what we are hearing from Dr. Toto and the coverage coming from games media outlets like IGN, Tech Radar, Bloomberg, and even GamesIndustry.biz are only one small slice of the pie when it comes to Dr. Toto, and even Sony's bold claims that something like 85% of game sales are already through digital. Thanks to this investigative report by Reddit user Revenant, we've learned that this independent games analyst actually, among his client groups, advises financial institutions interested in the gaming industry. So there's potential for conflict of interest when it comes to his quote, which every gaming outlet has now run with. You see, when a gaming boycott threatens the stock price of a company that his institutional investor client holds, games media not disclosing his titles and instead labeling him as some sort of independent analyst is a massive omission from their coverage of Dr. Toto. Plus, he already told us back in 2020 about the arithmetic of physical versus digital sales, where inside a post he said that with physical games for a $70 game, the retailer takes a 30% cut, along with 5% for the manufacturing and shipping, leaving Sony with approximately $45 or $45.50, while a digital sale on the PS Store would net Sony the full $70. Going on to write, from a purely financial perspective, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo are more incentivized to shun physical media on both an absolute and relative basis. How about that 85% figure we've been hearing about from Sony, claiming that they're just responding to the needs of gamers these days by moving to all digital because, 85% of sales are already there and buying digital? Yeah. Even that one's a lie, because what Sony includes in that 85% digital number can only be described as cooking the books. Here it is for all to see. Add-on content like DLC, Fortnite V-Bucks, and COD passes, 29%. Hardware, 24%. Digital software, 20%, so that's full game downloads. PS Plus network services, 14%. 10% other sales, and 3% physical software. So while Sony lists physical software at 3%, look at what they actually lump into digital. There's a telling summary this investigative report goes on to spell out at the end of this post that is extremely telling, and I want to read it to you now. It says, Sony is leaning on financial consultants to launder the story through the gaming press as consumer preference. But add it up. You've got a 54% software margin uplift, a $765 million crater from Bungie, a massive hardware margin squeeze, an EU regulatory regime that gets easier without a disk drive, multi-billion-dollar monopoly lawsuits, and a CEO who dumped half his direct holdings 48 hours after the announcement without a pre-scheduled plan. They aren't responding to what you want. They are forcing you to bail out their balance sheet and letting paid intermediaries call it destiny. And here we find ourselves in 2026, looking at a deadline that will effectively kill all physical media by 2028. And as Dr. Toto just spelled out for us in a post from way back in December 2020, this is clearly focused in on profits. This isn't about meeting the needs of the gamers and responding to the market and how we as consumers buy things. This is about Sony not wanting to give a 30% cut to retailers while making less money versus their digital sales. If this was about the fans, Sony wouldn't have added in 14-day DRM, they wouldn't have implemented a mechanic of variable rate pricing, and they wouldn't have already closed their major disc-making factories, repurposing them into now making other things like AI-related tech. Which brings us to what gamers are setting about doing in response to Sony's "you will own nothing and like it" dystopian future. As Tom's Hardware says, PS5 emulation ramps up in response to Sony killing physical games. PS5 titles now booting across different emulators with rapid community development for both 2D and 3D games. Because, when you try to slap around your consumers and player base, they have a way of fighting back. Exhibit A, the Helldivers 2 mandatory PSN linking disaster that ultimately exploded in Sony's face. You see, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen progress with these PS5 emulators explode because, before that, when we had access to physical games, these things weren't really being developed or even evolving. But now that Sony has decided to put its financial boot on gamers' necks, well, the progress on this front has been staggering. The intro to Silent Hill is already able to boot, while apparently Power Wash Simulator and even Pac-Man World are already playable. Grand Theft Auto 5 has made enough progress so that you can display the loading screens, main splash art, and even navigate the in-game settings. So when it comes to some of these analysts and games media articles saying that instead of hammering Sony over physical media, we should instead be focusing in on fighting for ownership over things like DRM. Just take those with a grain of salt because those are deflections. Now, would it be ideal to have both physical media and DRM? Yes, and who doesn't like both? But DRM is something that needed to be hit back in the early 2000s, and at this point, it's a red herring, a deflection to get gamers to focus on something that we won't be able to snatch away from these gaming corporations, as that ship has already sailed. But, that's just my take on it all. And as always, I look forward to reading your feedback. Anything and everything Sony, physical media, and the current state of gaming is fair game. So drop a comment. Let's get a healthy discussion going. If you happen to like the video, please hit subscribe and ring the notifications bell. And as always, I wanted to thank our incredible members who show up day in and day out to support the channel. Until the next one, this is Lieutenant Buzz Lightyear, signing out.